So maybe if we can, let's review the major developments real quick for folks. So first, everything was fine. We heard for years the banking system's strong. It's much better capitalized than it was prior to the 2008 crisis. We shouldn't worry about the banking system. Janet Yellen had famously said at one point, we're never going to see another banking crisis. And I'm not sure if it was our lifetime or her lifetime she was talking about, but basically trying to sell the story that, look, no matter what happens, like the banking system's the most rock solid part of the story at this point in time. Then all of a sudden we have three bank failures kind of in a row, right? Silvergate, Signature, and Silicon Valley Bank. Probably all for somewhat slightly different reasons. Silvergate was very exposed to what was happening in crypto. Silicon Valley Bank kind of had its own issues going on. But what created the opportunity for those banks to just all of a sudden keel over?
Okay, so this is actually a really, really good question that kind of touches on how the system works as a system, the financial system works. So if you go back, there's cycles, right? Everybody knows that there's these cycles that occur, and there's a whole bunch of cycles that occur all the time in industries. There's, various cycles within industries. But if you just take the big cycles, there are these big cycles that the financial industry will go through, okay? And then there are these little cycles. Well, if you think about the big cycles, you have to go back to 1973 for the beginning of the last big cycle, okay? And I'll talk about each one of these. But then you go back from 1973, you got to go back to the 1870s. That's the beginning of the big cycle before the one that begins in 1973. And then before that, there's a series of smaller cycles that happen kind of recurrently in that period between the Revolution and the Civil War, okay? But let's take those off the table because that's kind of a different scenario of what was going on back then. If you look at the three cycles, and then just recently with the coronavirus pandemic, that was the beginning of another cycle in the banking and finance industry, and I'll explain why. If you go back to 1870s, okay, what you saw back then was this is when the United States was emerging kind of on the world scene, right? This is the American Industrial Revolution, right? Like the assembly line, all these things are coming to fold, right? So we're making tons of money. Europe is fighting. We're injecting all this produce into Europe. So we're making a ton of money. A ton of money is flooding into the United States. What happens? It's the birth of disposable income. The birth of disposable income happens in the United States. And so what happens then is all this money is flooding in and piling up. And what does the finance industry do? It arbitrages money. So it sees this huge pile of money. And it's like, oh God, let's go arbitrage that thing. So everything since then, that huge pile of money is built up. Everything since it goes to into the 1920s, the craziness in the 1920s, all these regulatory and legal changes that happened in this period. And then the stock market flies up in this 1920s, and then it crashes in the Great Depression. And you have those regulatory changes that come up, like the FDIC and all these different things. And then that goes into World War II. So this goes all the way until 1973, okay? This cycle right here, from that big pile of money downhill until 1973. What happens in 1973 is there's a break in time. Just like a cut, it's like you're cutting the fabric of time, starting all over again. What causes us to start all over again? The oil crisis in 1973. So you had the Yom Kippur War. We support Israel. The Arab states retaliate against us by putting an embargo on oil exports to the United States. That causes oil prices to shoot up, inflation to shoot up. Paul Volcker then comes in and causes interest rates to shoot up. There's a mismatch crisis, and all these things happen. And then that leads into the financial crisis of 2008. And Ben Bernanke, he wrote a big paper on this, and he calls it the global savings glut. So that's the second big cycle of the modern era. The third one begins with the coronavirus pandemic, and here's why. So you think about that big pile of money with disposable income. That's one huge pile of money. You think about the second big pile of money, which is this pile of money that is amassing in the coffers of these oil-producing countries. They're euro dollars because it's dollars, but they're not repatriated in the United States. They're just building up. So what do the banks want to do? Arbitrage that money. So they go and they arbitrage that money, right? And so everything since then has been happening as a result of that. And then the coronavirus strikes. And what happens? A ton of money floods into the system, a ton of money, right? You have the fiscal relief, you have the monetary relief. And why, GDP in the second quarter of 2020, on an annualized basis, it fell like 30%, right? Which is huge. That's more than the Great Depression. So the government comes and pours all this money into the system. And so now it's starting to make its way out of the system. And the one thing that we know when liquidity makes its way out of a system is that it never just quietly exits out the side door. It like bangs its way out the front. And so this was the first knock on the door that we'll see. And this pile of money will probably define, it could be 20 years, it could be 30 years, it could be 50 years, but that big pile of money will define the next few decades in banking. So this is remember those two piles of money I was telling you about?
Mm-hmm.
Here's the two piles of money right here. So this is the one on your left, that's your birth or disposable income. The one on your right, and I just for aesthetic reasons, I made them like look like that. The one on your right actually should be like going out the same way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see the numbers are backwards.
Yeah, so that's euro dollars right there from that oil crisis. Now if you want to know like what caused those two piles of money, here's what it is. This is the entire history of the United States. Okay, this is the trade surplus versus the trade deficit. This is what it looks like. The first 96 years, every single year but for 4 years was a trade deficit. It then switches every single year for 96 years but for 4 years. I mean, it's uncanny. Is a trade surplus. Then it switches back every single year since basically 1970 has been a trade deficit. Well, the key thing is here is that when you have economy the size of the United States, it switches between a trade deficit into a trade surplus or a trade surplus into a trade deficit. Think about the torrent of money you're dealing with there. Huge amounts of money. And so those are the things that begin the crisis, that began those two eras, those two big piles of money. The switches right there between those two things.